a battle that stood between Islam and extinction. A moment when a small, exhausted group of believers faced an army 3 times their size. The Battle of Badr was not just a clash of swords, it was a turning point that protected Islam from being wiped out in its earliest days. So critical was this moment that Allah sent divine assistance, and angels descended to support the believers on the battlefield. Today we revisit the Battle of Badr, not as a distant historical event, but as a living lesson of faith, sacrifice, and trust in Allah during the darkest hour. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It's always inspiring to see how far our family reaches. Let's begin the journey. As that moment of survival draws closer, we must step back in time to understand how the Muslims reached such a fragile point. The Battle of Badr did not begin on a battlefield. It began years earlier in the streets of Mecca, where the message of Islam first challenged the foundations of power, wealth, and tradition. In Mecca, the early Muslims were a small and vulnerable community. Their belief in one God threatened the authority of Quraysh, whose influence depended on idol worship and tribal dominance. What began as mockery soon turned into open persecution. Muslims were beaten, boycotted, and socially isolated. Families were torn apart, and many were forced to practice their faith in silence. Despite this pressure, the message of Islam continued to spread, carried by patience rather than force. When life in Makkah became unbearable, permission was given to migrate. The hijrah to Medina was not an escape of weakness, but a strategic turning point. In Medina, the Prophet Muhammad built a society based on faith, justice, and mutual responsibility. The Muhajirun arrived with almost nothing, leaving behind their homes, wealth, and businesses. The Ansar welcomed them as brothers, sharing what they had and laying the foundation of a united community. Yet peace in Medina did not mean safety. Quraysh had not forgiven the loss of control, nor the spread of Islam beyond Makkah. They seized the property left behind by the Muslims and used it to fund trade caravans and strengthen their influence. The wounds of persecution were still fresh, and the tension between the two sides quietly grew with each passing day. So the question remains, after years of patience, loss, and rebuilding, what finally brought these two sides face to face? What single event transformed a long-standing struggle into an open confrontation on the sands of Badr? To answer that, we now turn to the cause of the battle. Tension does not always lead to war, but sometimes a single moment brings years of injustice to the surface. The cause of the Battle of Badr was not a sudden desire for conflict. It was the result of calculated pressure, broken trust, and a growing realization that coexistence with Quraysh was no longer possible. The Muslims in Medina were building a new society, yet they remained economically vulnerable. Their wealth in Mecca had been taken, their livelihoods destroyed, and their enemies continued to profit from what was stolen. Quraysh trade caravans moved confidently across the region, protected by status and influence, while the Muslims watched from a distance, fully aware that these journeys were funded by their own lost property. When news reached Medina of a major Quraysh caravan returning from Syria under the leadership of Abu Sufyan, the moment carried significance beyond commerce. This caravan represented power, security, and the message that Quraysh still controlled the future. The Muslims did not march out seeking bloodshed. Their intention was limited, their expectation restrained, and the situation still uncertain. Yet Quraysh interpreted even this movement as a challenge to their dominance. Abu Sufyan acted swiftly, rerouting the caravan and sending an urgent call to Mecca. The response was immediate and aggressive. Quraysh gathered an army not to protect trade, but to assert authority, to intimidate Medina, and to send a clear message that Islam would not be allowed to rise unopposed. What began as an economic matter now carried the weight of pride, revenge, and fear of losing control. As both sides moved forward, the possibility of retreat quietly faded. Decisions were made, alliances hardened, and the path toward confrontation was set. But where would this meeting take place? Why did the timing of this encounter hold such deep meaning? And how did the landscape itself shape what was about to unfold? To answer these questions, we turn to the location and timing of Badr. As the two sides moved closer to one another, the setting of the encounter became just as significant as the reasons behind it. The place was Badr, a quiet area southwest of Medina, known not for warfare, but for its life-giving wells. In a land where water meant survival, control over these wells could determine the outcome of any confrontation. What appeared to be an ordinary stop along trade routes was, in reality, a location where fate would be decided. The timing of this encounter carried equal weight. It was the month of Ramadan, a period associated with patience, reflection, and spiritual discipline. The Muslims were fasting, physically limited, yet spiritually focused. This was not a season chosen for battle, nor a time when strength and endurance would naturally be at their peak. Yet history often unfolds at unexpected moments, and Badr would become a test of resolve under conditions that seemed unfavorable. As events unfolded, movements on both sides narrowed the distance to this very spot. The desert, the wells, and the timing all combined to shape the choices that followed. Every step toward Badr reduced the chances of withdrawal, turning anticipation into inevitability. The ground beneath their feet would soon bear witness to a confrontation that would echo far beyond that single day. But as the battlefield took shape, another question demanded attention. Who exactly stood on each side of this encounter? How did their numbers, preparation, and resources compare? And what did this imbalance mean for the outcome that awaited them? To understand that, we must now examine the strength of both armies. As the two forces finally stood within reach of one another, the difference between them became impossible to ignore. On one side was a small group of believers who had not set out expecting a full-scale battle. Many were lightly equipped, sharing mounts, carrying limited weapons, and relying more on resolve than resources. Their strength did not lie in numbers or material power, but in unity and conviction, forged through years of hardship. Facing them was an army that represented the full weight of Quraysh authority. They arrived with confidence, well-armed and well-supplied, supported by experience, wealth, and pride. Their presence alone was meant to intimidate, to crush resistance before the first clash even began. By every visible measure, this force appeared unstoppable, while the Muslims seemed overwhelmingly outmatched. Yet strength is not always measured by what can be seen. Beneath the surface, morale, intention, and purpose quietly shape outcomes. The Muslims stood with clarity of belief, aware of what they were defending and what they were willing to sacrifice. The opposing army stood driven by status and fear of losing control. This contrast would soon prove more decisive than swords or shields. Still, such an imbalance raises an important question. How does a smaller, less equipped force prepare to face an army built for dominance? What choices, decisions, and guidance would determine whether this moment ended in defeat or in history being rewritten? To answer that, we now turn to leadership and strategy. When the odds appear impossible, leadership becomes the deciding factor. At Badr, guidance was not driven by impulse or arrogance, but by wisdom, consultation, and calm certainty. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ did not command blindly. He listened, reflected, and involved his companions in decisions that would shape their fate. In moments of uncertainty, voices were heard, concerns were acknowledged, and unity was strengthened through trust. Every movement was deliberate. The positioning near resources, the awareness of terrain, and the discipline within the ranks reflected a leadership rooted in responsibility rather than ambition. There was no false confidence, only clarity of purpose. The companions were not promised ease, but they were given direction, and that direction brought order to a situation that could have easily descended into chaos. Equally powerful was the spiritual leadership displayed in these moments. The night before the encounter was filled with reflection and reliance on Allah. Leadership here was not limited to tactics on the ground, but extended to preparing hearts and minds. It reminded the believers that effort and trust must walk together, especially when the outcome is uncertain. With leadership established and strategy set, there was nothing left but to face the moment itself. What followed next would not be decided by planning alone. When the first clash began, which moments shifted the course of the encounter, and how did a single day transform fear into triumph? To uncover that, we now turn to the key moments of the battle. When the moment of confrontation finally arrived, the silence of the desert gave way to events that would define an era. The battle did not erupt all at once. It unfolded in stages, each moment carrying weight far beyond the clash itself. Early encounters tested resolve and sent a clear message that this was no longer a matter of intimidation. What began cautiously soon turned into a full confrontation as both sides committed to the fight. As the struggle intensified, confusion and dust filled the air. Individual acts of courage began to shift morale, and what once seemed like an overwhelming advantage started to fracture. The believers, though fewer, moved with discipline and purpose, holding their ground despite exhaustion and fear. The momentum of the encounter slowly changed, not through force alone, but through steadfastness in the face of pressure. Then came the turning point, a moment when the balance visibly shifted. Confidence spread through the ranks of the Muslims, while hesitation and uncertainty crept into the opposing force. What had begun as a display of power now felt unstable, as control slipped away in ways that could not be fully explained by strategy or numbers alone. This sudden change raises a deeper question. What unseen factors were at work on that day? How did events unfold in a way that went beyond human effort? And what does the Quran reveal about the assistance granted at Badr? To explore this, we now turn to divine help and Quranic references. As the dust settled over the battlefield, it became clear that what unfolded at Badr could not be understood through physical means alone. The believers themselves recognized that something greater was at work. This was not merely a victory of endurance or courage. It was a moment where the unseen intersected with the seen, and where reliance on Allah was answered in a way that would be remembered forever. The Quran later addressed this day with clarity and purpose, reminding the believers that success did not come from their own strength. Allah revealed that help was sent at a moment of extreme vulnerability, reinforcing hearts that stood firm despite fear and exhaustion. These verses did not glorify battle. They clarified reality, teaching that when sincere faith is combined with effort, divine support can arrive in forms beyond human expectation. What makes these references so powerful is their timing. They were not revealed to impress an audience, but to ground the believers in humility. Victory was not a reason for pride, it was a reminder of dependence. The message was clear. Numbers do not decide outcomes, and power does not belong solely to those who appear strong. True support comes when intention is pure and trust is complete. But divine assistance did not end the story. When the fighting stopped and the reality of victory became undeniable, new challenges emerged. What was the final result of this historic encounter? And how did its outcome reshape the future of the Muslim community from that very day forward? To understand that, we now turn to the outcome of the battle. When the battle came to an end, the result stunned both sides. What had begun as an encounter overshadowed by fear concluded with a clear and decisive victory for the believers. The field of Badr no longer echoed with the sounds of combat, but with the reality that the balance of power in Arabia had shifted. Those who once viewed the Muslims as vulnerable now had to confront a new truth. Yet the outcome of Badr was not defined by triumph alone. Loss was felt deeply, and sacrifice left its mark on the community. The companions who gave their lives were honored, their commitment sealing the seriousness of the cause they stood for. At the same time, those taken captive were not met with cruelty. Instead, a standard of justice and mercy emerged that surprised even enemies, reflecting values that stood apart from the norms of warfare at the time. News of the result traveled quickly beyond the battlefield. Allies reconsidered their positions, opponents reassessed their confidence, and the Muslim community gained recognition it had never possessed before. Badr was no longer just a location. It had become a statement that faith, when supported by discipline and principle, could no longer be ignored. But victory always carries responsibility. What lessons were drawn from this moment, and how did Badr shape the character, conduct, and mindset of the believers moving forward? To answer that, we now turn to the lessons and wisdom of Badr. The Battle of Badr did not end when the battlefield fell silent. Its true impact unfolded in the hearts and actions of those who lived through it. This moment taught the believers that faith is not passive. It demands effort, patience, and discipline, even when the outcome feels uncertain. Trust in Allah was not shown through words alone, but through standing firm when fear was real and loss was possible. Badr also reshaped how strength was understood. It revealed that unity outweighs numbers and purpose outweighs power. The believers learned that obedience, sincerity, and moral restraint are not weaknesses, but sources of resilience. Victory was not a license for arrogance. It was a responsibility that required humility and gratitude, reminding them that success can disappear as easily as it arrives. Perhaps the most lasting wisdom of Badr lies in how it balanced justice with mercy. Even in a moment of dominance, compassion was not abandoned. This taught the Muslim community that principles do not change with circumstances. Whether in hardship or ease, character must remain consistent. Badr stands as a reminder that moments of crisis often define direction. It shows that when faith is grounded in action and guided by integrity, even the most fragile beginnings can shape the course of history. If this journey through Badr helped you see its meaning more clearly, let us know your thoughts in the comments. What lesson from this battle stood out to you the most? If you found value in this documentary, consider liking the video and sharing it with others who may benefit from it. And if you want to continue exploring powerful moments from Islamic history, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next.